question we've got this week comes in from Paul. Paul says, "Hi, I've got a question about training hours. I have a Dylan Johnson training on 15 hours a week that I was training a lot more, closer to 10 hours a week on and off. And at the time I was planning on bumping up to 15 hours a week, but I had some issues with my PSA numbers. When you get older, PSA is a blood marker that could mean that you have prostate cancer. The urologist had me cut back and take time off the bike, and my PSA numbers were still high. Then I did an MRI on my prostate, so they say that they said there was a high chance of having prostate cancer. To find out for sure, I needed to do a biopsy, so I did that. Then I got an infection, and that took me off the bike for 3 to 4 weeks. So here's my question. Can I just start with Dylan's training plan, or do I need to build back up to start the plan? I do not have prostate cancer, thank the Lord, and can get back to training, but have been having some family issues for right now. But as soon as I am able to start training again, I was planning on starting the faster on 15 hours training plan. Issues I had from the biopsy was 5 days in the hospital on antibiotics and bleeding from my prostate and a tear in my urethra from the catheter. That is the reason I was off the bike for so long. What would be the best way to start if you were going to do that training plan? P.S. I am 50 years old. 59 years old.
59.
59. Well, we are glad to hear that you are no longer thinking you had prostate cancer. That's great to hear. Sounds like you at least right now are cleared to get back to training, but have some home life stuff that you're working through. But basically, Paul wants to know, once family stuff's over, maybe waiting for the holidays to get over. So let's, look ahead when Paul no longer has as much obligations off the bike to work through. What would be the best plan of action as far as trying to build back up to getting onto Dylan's 15 hours a week plan?
Yeah. Before we say anything, I just feel like there were a lot of unfortunate issues arise from the biopsy. So make sure that your doctor has completely cleared you with all of that considered. And if that's the case and you can resume normal training, I think his question is, can I jump back to 15 hours after a month off? I wouldn't suggest that. Partly because you are an older athlete, but I mean, even if I took a month totally off the bike, I wouldn't jump back to 15 hours. If you can continue that for consecutive weeks, I think that's just going to be too much overload. So I would suggest jumping back to 8 hours and maybe doing that for a couple of weeks. You'll feel a lot better and not have to take time off. Had you overdone it, jumping back to 15 hours, I think a more gentle, linear progression would be better.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I don't know that I was hoping Dylan was going to be on this week so he could give us some more insight here, but so I don't know the exact specifics of Dylan's 15 hours a week training plan. I don't know if it starts with base and then goes all the way through a specialty phase, or if it starts in a build phase. But regardless, I mean, that however that plan is laid out, it's probably already assuming that you're training close to 15 hours a week. And for starters, Paul mentions that he purchased Dylan's training plan with the intention of bumping up from 10 hours a week to 15 hours a week. So it was already going to be a pretty sizable step up from his previous or current training load. So I totally agree, Kaitlyn. I think the safe approach would be to first off build back up to the volume of training that you were at previously, and don't just go straight to that. Starting at 8 hours a week and build back up to 10, and then I would even almost say like a couple weeks or a month at some intermediate stage. So like 12 to 13 hours a week, because going from 10 hours to 15 hours, that's a 50% increase in volume. That alone might be too much. So I think, you might want to take 3 months to just build up to 15 hours a week here. I think you're just going to get more bang for your buck with that training plan. It's going to be more effective, and it's going to be less risky of burning out or overextending yourself. I also don't know how Dylan has his training blocks periodized if he's on like a 2-week versus a 3-week cycle. But that's something to keep in mind too. As a little bit older athlete, recovery is very important. And, you're at the age where sometimes we've talked about this. We might recommend a 3-week training cycle instead of a traditional 4-week training cycle. Depends kind of what your ability level is, I would say, and just how well you're adapting and recovering to the training. But if it is a 4-week training cycle, the way that's laid out in Dylan's plan, which is what I would assume to be the case, that's another thing to consider. That's a lot of extra training that you're getting in that 4-week cycle, being 15 hours a week and 3 weeks without a recovery week. So there's just a lot to consider here. And I think the more conservative approach is probably best to just make sure you're getting the most out of yourself.
Yeah, I agree. There's no reason why you can't use that plan in the future, but I think a more conservative return to training protocol where you're just easing back into it, riding, to feel. Wake up in the morning, get on the bike, see how you feel, and if you feel like going harder, then do that. But plan for an easier day the next day. And
yeah, I think that's great. Okay, let's move on. We got a question here from Simon. Simon says, "Hola, amigos. My name is Simon. I'm a 46-year-old tattoo artist from Colombia, but I live in New York City. Been here for 16 years. Been racing bicycles from a very early age, BMX, cross-country, mountain bike, and rode at an elite level back in the 90s. That's awesome. Also downhill mountain biking, and then also at an elite level a little bit later after a few years break. Quit for a while and started racing road in the US again. It says like 10 or 11 years ago. And the past few years, he's been mostly racing gravels. Basically, Simon has raced
all of the
everything.
disciplines.
Man, that is awesome.
That's cool.
I have a very easy work schedule since I manage my own appointments. I take my first appointment at 1 p.m. and wake up very early, and I don't have kids. My only problem is winter. So here's my question. Is it possible to do a preseason in October/November and keep some of that endurance through the winter by only riding on the trainer? I can't stand more than 2 hours, and I try to fit a 2 to 3 week trip back to Colombia in January. Or is it better to just spin on the trainer after the season is done and start a block around April? Since the races I want to hit are around 120 miles and the season starts in May, thanks for all the free knowledge. Best, Simon. This is a great question, actually. So let's not consider too much. I mean, it's great that Simon's got a flexible schedule, but if we want to just kind of generalize this for just every athlete that's out there that has to deal with winter, more or less, so if you're living in North America and like, the top half of the United States, you're going to have a winter season. I mean, there's plenty of places that you have to deal with winter. So let's just kind of address it from that angle. Like, what is an option for keeping some of that fitness, building back some of that fitness, all while you're dealing with brutal winter months where it's probably difficult to get outside. I'm guessing too, since Simon lives in New York City, that makes it even more challenging to ride in the winter time. So what are your thoughts on this? He proposes like a preseason October, November timeframe, just kind of build up some base before the winter months.
Well, it says he's been doing gravel the past few years, so my first question would be, when did your season end? Because I do think you need a proper off season where you're a little more focused on cross training and strength and just a overall mental break from riding. So if you have that, just say proper 2 weeks off, and you feel like you're in a place to enjoy the nicer weather while you have it, I don't see why not. The only caveat to trying to maintain that through the winter is that he doesn't want to spend more than 2 hours on a trainer. So that's, I think, to maintain that aerobic base. But I mean, he doesn't say how many days per week he can ride. It sounds like he's pretty open. So not having those longer sessions, I don't think it's the end of the world, but I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I'm actually less concerned about the whole aspect of trying to maintain whatever you build during those months. I think of it more as like just kind of shifting a little bit of like when you're doing higher volume. So I actually think this is a really good idea and something that I do tend to do with some of my athletes. So the tradition is always like you finish your race season, let's say you finish it in September, end of September, early October, and then you take your off-season break right there. Depending on where my athlete's at, if they're not burning the candle at both ends and really needing that off-season break right then, a lot of times with my athletes that are in climates that are going to be turning to winter and it's going to be more challenging to get outside and put in volume, I'll kind of give them the freedom to say, let's just extend your season another month or two of just doing base training, take advantage of the weather. Like as long as they're in a good mental state, I'm not actually super worried physically for them at that time. And then plan to take the holidays as like your forced holiday, off-season break. So kind of postponing that off-season break until the winter months set in. And I just like that because it's like you have to take advantage of the weather while you've got it for a lot of these folks, myself included. So what this does is it just, when you're forced to take time off the bike in October when the riding weather is beautiful and you're just kind of like really bummed about the fact that you can't take time off or you can't take time to go ride your bike like in the perfect riding conditions, I just find that it's not as refreshing as like when you take that break in the winter and you really get a chance to just kind of like relax. You're not antsy because you don't really want to be outside anyways. Plus, like with the holidays and things like that, people always, their schedules tend to get, all mixed up in, travel and spending time with family and holiday season parties and obligations and things like that. And it just gets really hard to fit structured training in around that time anyways. So I'd rather try and like shift it like that for those athletes. So, and I would put Simon right in that category here. Whether you have, the holiday season slam of, plans or not, it's still for most people, around mid to end December is really when winter starts setting in pretty good. So it's like, I'd rather just see a off-season break be taken then. I don't think that putting in that base season work before taking off-season break is all for naught. Like that's what part of what periodization and year after year training progression looks like is you load one year, you deload, and you start again. You're not starting from scratch ever unless you are starting from scratch, as long as you have something to build upon. And what I find too is if an athlete does some of those base season training blocks at the end of their race season, it just makes it easier for us to transition back into training after that holiday break, where, it might take a week or two to get, your feet back under you. But once you do, like, you have a pretty solid foundation to build back on. So I really like the idea of it, especially for him. I'm thinking about the fact that Simon says he's going to be going to Colombia for, what was it, 2 to 3 weeks in January? So it's like, Simon, I mean, if I were you, I would take advantage of October, November. I know, like, Simon sent this question in a couple weeks ago, so we're getting to this, already halfway through November, but, keep this in mind for future seasons too, or, maybe it's still nice enough there to get outside right now, but, take advantage of those October, November nice days. Try and get as much base training as you can in during that time. Take your off-season break probably sometime mid to late December, take a couple weeks off, and then maybe give yourself 1 week back on the bike before you go to Colombia, just to get your feet under you, like I was talking about. And then you can go down to Colombia and smash a 2 or 3 week training block and really get a lot out of it. And I would bet by the time you come out of that 2 to 3 week training trip down to Colombia,
Is it a training trip? I thought it was just totally off. Like this was a vacation.
I was assuming
Yeah.
it was a, like, not necessarily a training trip, but like a chance to go down and get some training in. If that's not the case, if Colombia is your holiday trip, let's say, then use that as maybe you take that as your off season, and that way you take the stress off of training while you're traveling. I think that's a great idea. I just like to try and make it as convenient as possible for people when I'm planning out their off season break, so that it just fits their schedule as best as possible. So if that means taking time off during the holidays because it's really hard to fit training in during the holidays, or maybe taking time off when you're going on a big travel trip because it's going to be hard to fit training in around your travel trip, whatever it is, like whatever's the most convenient time to take that off-season break, that's typically what I do. Now, some of my like elite level athletes that are training 20 hours a week, they're ready for that off-season break as soon as the race season's over usually. So like I might give them a couple weeks and say, hey, ride for a couple weeks, see how your body feels. If you're tired, let's just take this off-season break. And that's usually the case. But for a lot of athletes, they're not forced to take that off-season break as soon as the race season ends. So that's kind of, usually the determination that I will use here. I would just say, like for Simon, yeah, I mean, take the off-season break whenever it is most convenient and makes sense for you. And then you can fit your some of your base season, like you're talking about here, the preseason, like you can fit some of that in before that off-season break, and then you kind of just resume that once your off-season break is over. As far as like mixing in gym work and stuff too, I still would say that, what we're talking about here, those months immediately after your race season's over, I think that probably is still an appropriate time to reintroduce your strength training. If you haven't been maintaining that, or let's say you have been maintaining it, but you want to get back into like producing some adaptations in the gym instead of just maintenance workouts, I think that October, November, when we're just doing base season training, is the perfect time to reintroduce that. And that's going to be the emphasis. That's going to be where your focused intensity is going to come from, is in those gym sessions. And we're probably not doing much as far as maintenance intensity even goes, maybe once a week or once every other week, even depending on what the athlete's doing. We're just doing a little bit of intensity on the bike just to keep things kind of sharp and maintained, but shifting more emphasis to strength training.
Yeah. And getting your body used to that stimulus so that when you do go on this trip to Colombia, assuming that you won't have the bike, you'll be able to do some more consistent strength sessions and maybe some cross training while you're there. I do think this plan that we've been discussing is a whole lot better than he mentioned. Should I just spin on the trainer after the season is over and then plan for a block in April? But if your season starts in May, that's a little late.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be more like starting from scratch instead of trying to not maintain, but build off of this last season that you've had.
Yeah, I think about it in more than just like a 1-year cycle. It's like, if you think about it in more of like a 5-year cycle, it's like how big can you build your aerobic base in 5 years? So no matter what time of the year, if you're doing base training, if you're doing aerobic conditioning, it's all accumulating towards like your overall aerobic fitness. So whether that's happening in October, November, before you go on the trainer and, take a dip in volume because of, just monotony, or if it's happening in the mid-season, or if it's happening in the traditional base season, it's all kind of contributing to your underlying aerobic base. And I think people kind of get in this mindset where every year they feel like they're restarting from scratch, and that's not the case. Every year it's building on. As long as you're maintaining some quality structure and training throughout the season, you should be building on that aerobic base year after year. To the extent where, when you take that 2 or 3 months in the winter months where you're dropping your volume, you should be able to maintain fitness level quite well. And then, maybe April is when you can ramp the volume back up, but you shouldn't be like starting your training from the bottom up in April. Like, it should be really building onto your training at that point. Cool. Anything else to add here for Simon?
So good luck during those New York winters.
Yeah, for sure. Let's see. Okay, last one here. This one comes from Ruben. I actually thought this was a really good question too. Ruben says, you may have covered this before, so if so, ignore and I apologize, which we've kind of touched on this before, but I think it's really good to revisit. My question is, what would be more beneficial to training? More often with less time, or less time but more often, or some mix of that? This year, I hope to spend 10 to 12 hours on the bike, and I'm wondering if it would be better to do 2-hour rides 5 days a week, or a few 3 to 4-hour rides a couple times a week. And if it were to be mixed where I would do intervals, where would intervals be most effective? On a shorter day or a longer ride day? Races for me would likely be shorter, so he's talking 1.5 to 2 hours, I think probably like cross-country mountain biking. And then possibly races like lumberjack or coast to coast. So now we're talking like ultra racing. Thanks, Ruben.
It is such a good question, but there's so much, it depends. There always has to be some give and take. So if you're ramping up your intensity, then I think your volume should drop back a little bit. It depends on where you're starting from. So he gives some examples here. hopes to spend 10 to 12 hours on the bike. So I guess that's kind of his top end with his schedule. So 10 to 12 hours. His first question, would it be better to do 2-hour rides 5 days a week or 3 to 4 hours? Or 3 to 4, what is it?
Like a couple 3 to 4 hour rides a
Yeah,
week.
yeah.
So like yeah.
Yeah, I think it depends on the periodization where you are. I think we've talked about um, consistency. So, it does sound better that you're riding 5 days in a week. So I would say I think that's a good place to start. But as you get closer to those longer races, your volume is going to need to go up even more so than 3 to 4 hours if you want to do a race like Lumberjack. How? Because that's what
Yeah,
is
like
that?
Lumberjack's 100-mile mountain bike race. Coast to
Yeah,
coast, I think, is like 200-mile gravel race, I want to say, up in Michigan. So yeah, we're talking long races here.
yeah.
Yeah, so
I don't even know where to start. Yeah,
I mean, so here's the thing. I agree it does kind of depend, but if let's just say Ruben here's got a blank slate, he can do whatever he wants. He can do 5 days a week at 2 hours, or he can mix in some of these longer rides with some shorter rides. I'm guessing it's not just like 3 4-hour rides compared to 5 2-hour rides. Like I'm guessing Ruben could also probably do some shorter rides if he was mixing in some of these longer rides. I mean, one thing that I think about for me and like with my athletes is most studies kind of show that the effect of endurance training beyond 2 really 3 hours is when you start to get the mitochondrial adaptations where you're increasing the number of mitochondrial. I usually use 3 hours as kind of like a rule of thumb. If we're going to do a long ride, I try and make it 3 hours for folks. So I like to see at least 1 3-hour ride in a week for athletes that are seriously training and have the availability to do so. If they don't, like, that's just the nature of the game. But if they have the availability to do 1 3-hour plus ride per week, and then once you're doing that 3-hour ride, that's when you can really start building upon that too. So like if Ruben's training for Lumberjack and needs to build up to an 8-hour race effort, let's say, or whatever, however long it's going to be, you can build that 3-hour long ride into 4 or 5, maybe even 6 hours where you're really extending that, and you can get a lot of effect on like mitochondrial density. So that's just what I think. Like my first thought when I see this question posed as a bunch of 2-hour rides versus mixing in some 3 to 4 hour rides. I would prefer to see that 3 or 4 hour ride mixed in once or twice a week, and then even reducing those other rides down sub 2 hours. That's my take on that. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
yeah. And now that we talk it out a little bit, it doesn't sound like there's much limitation. Like this sounds like the average athlete, like 10 to 12 hours per week, and able to do a little bit longer on the weekends, but have to keep it shorter during the week. So there's so many different ways that you can schedule this out. I mean, does he talk about, was this the question where he asked when to, yeah.
Yeah. So as far as like when to mix in intensity.
Yeah. And I think having those shorter rides be your intensity sessions during the week. But then I think there's also a time and place where you want to push that to the weekend when you can do the longer rides and do some endurance, tack on some endurance to the front side or the back side of those intervals, kind of sandwich them in the middle or push them towards the end just for that type of stimulus. But yeah, I think it just depends on where you are, like how you structure your intervals depends on where you are in your training cycle.
Yeah, 100% agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, did we answer his question?
Yeah,
or...
I mean, I tend to think that I know we've talked about this. We talked about this last week actually. That those 30, 60, 90-minute endurance sessions shouldn't just be overlooked and thought of as like unimportant or ineffective, because they are. Again, like everything kind of helps to contribute towards your overall aerobic base. So I don't want to like discount or downplay the effectiveness of those shorter sessions, even if it's just aerobic training. I tend to prefer an athlete if they're only going to spend 60, if they only have a 60-minute time window, I tend to rather see them do that as a hit session where they can get on the bike, knock out some trainer intervals, or get outside for an hour, knock out some intervals, and just kind of like keep it short and sweet, where you're then able to preserve some of those longer sessions for really focusing on just the aerobic conditioning,
Mm-hmm.
The base miles. So as far as like mixing this in, the intensity in, I would say if it were me and I was just generally going to, give a rule of thumb, I would say for your base season for sure, trying to keep those intensity sessions for the shorter sessions. And then as you build, maybe even like the second half of build is when you would maybe start introducing those into some of your longer rides where you're really trying to simulate closer to what the race effect or effort is going to be like. So mixing in a 3-hour ride with some intervals or 4-hour ride with some intervals just to get you closer to simulate what that long race is going to look like. But it also depends here. Ruben talks about doing a lot of shorter 1.5 to 2 hour races, so traditional cross country races. So I certainly wouldn't shift all of your intervals to those longer rides. I do think that you can likely get more out of yourself and hit some higher quality efforts if the session is shorter, but yeah, I think closer to a lumberjack or coast to coast is when you start mixing in some of those efforts into those longer rides.
What do you think about during the base season? He drops his intensity sessions to just once per week and maximizes those longer rides.
Yeah, I could get down with that too. Yep. But yeah, that'd be, I think we both would agree that mixing in at least one of those longer rides is going to be more beneficial than just doing the.
Yeah.
I know like we harp on consistency a lot on this podcast because consistency is really important for quality training, but it doesn't sound like Ruben's really struggling with consistency. He's just wondering like what is the better approach here. So I would say, yeah, if you're able to mix in that 3 to 4 hour ride a week or 2 of those, if you do 2 of those and then 2 shorter sessions, I think that's going to be better than 5 days a week at 2 hours.
I agree. Yeah.
Cool. Well, I think that's going to wrap it up there.
Sounds good.
All right. We're not sure about next week because next week is the holiday, but if we don't see you next week, we'll see you 2 weeks from now.
Happy Thanksgiving.
See ya.